Hi, welcome again to Universal Harmony Illustrated. I welcome you back if you're watching for a repeat episode. This is a story of a witnessing of spiritual dominion over cancer. It's been well over 20 years ago that I documented carefully in writing the details of the account that I'm going to present to you here in video form. I know it was important to preserve the thoughts about these occurrences at the time, so I took the time to really write them down in detail. So the details that I'm recounting are pretty accurate because I wrote them down immediately. And this experience brought to me a distinct and beautiful awareness of divine love. It brought a beautiful awareness of divine love to another man before he passed from this human plane of existence on to whatever his next plane of existence is. So, at the time that I wrote down these details and experienced this sequence of events, I had just at that time completed an intensive, as you would say, course of study on spiritual healing in a classroom retreat-like environment that lasted for a couple of weeks. It was a very significant period of spiritual development for me. And it's significant that this occurred immediately following that spiritual development experience that I had for myself. The names and relationships between the people involved have been excluded out of respect for confidentiality of the family. They were people that were related to me at the time. This was as powerful of an experience for the man who went through it as it was for me. Or maybe I should say it the other way around. So I wasn't sure how to title this experience, because it was an experience that included clear evidence of the power of spiritual perception to bring about a state of dominion over the disease called cancer in this case, that yet its final outcome felt to me less than fully satisfying. Because in the end, the appearance of death was not overcome. Yet, the physical changes that did take place and the positive changes that took place in consciousness as a result of the mental work involved in all this was quite positive in the big picture. And as we get on down towards the end of relating this story, you'll understand more what I mean by that. After this experience, which of course wasn't a direct experience of my own, but one in which my own active thought played a vital role, after this, I lost myself all personal fear of cancer. And I lost any temptation to ever believe that cancer is an objective thing that has the power to go around and claim human victims. I witnessed firsthand, through the events I'm going to relate to you now, proof that we already have dominion over cancer. And that this already present dominion can be accessed spiritually, mentally, through a personal individual recognition of God is an ever active guiding principle of love. So I'm not even talking about God in a way that most people think of God in a religious way. I'm not talking about the conception of God as an external power or as a human-like entity that somehow inexplicably operates independently of us and that it's believed we have to go and appeal to. This experience I'm going to tell you about here led me to a deeper understanding of the concept that God is not an objective external force, not a human-like thing, or a thing that we need to appeal to in a human-like way. For me, and for my friend that was involved in this sequence of experiences, God works subjectively. God is just a name used to refer to the deep-rooted source that is each and every one of us. Now, there isn't anything that can provide the depth I feel in a statement like that any more than recounting this human story, because the sentences I just spoke are far from sufficient to do that. That's a problem with language. So the relating of an experience give you a much better intuitive feel for what I mean. I believe that a subjective interpretation of the power of the divine principle of love, God, if you will, I believe this is the cure for cancer so sought after today and which is never going to be found in a laboratory. So this relative friend of mine who was related to me through marriage was suffering from what had been mentally diagnosed as a very serious case of cancer, digestive tract cancer. I'd never been up to this point as close to this individual as I'd hoped to be. And up to that point in my life, I'd been very cautious and really afraid to offer spiritual healing assistance to others. But I just completed this retreat course and I was feeling very inspired. Now, I was raised in an atmosphere of purely spiritual healing. We didn't do things medically. But I always felt like this way of looking at life more or less sort of automatically puts up a wall between me and the way most people interpret life. And so it always caused me to be very quiet and private about the way I feel about spiritual things. But this case had become quite serious and had become, in human terms, a matter of life and death. At this point, the medical diagnosis was terminal and has caused a lot of fear on the part of this man and on the part of his family. And over the course of many months, my friend had become so physically weak that this time when he was hospitalized, it turned out to be the final time he was hospitalized. He was taken in because he was no longer able to digest anything, and he was no longer able to support his own weight. So while he was in the hospital and I learned of this seriousness of his condition, a couple of days after he'd been admitted, I visited him in the hospital on a Saturday afternoon. During that visit, there was a lot of family around. There wasn't any chance to be alone with him. So in the presence of his family, I just leaned down and quietly affirmed to him that God's love was always with him. And that was a start. The following evening, I returned to the hospital by myself for another visit after I knew all the family members had all gone home. He was initially, when I walked in, semi-conscious. Sometimes his eyes were open, sometimes his eyes were closed. And he was obviously under the influence of a narcotic painkiller, morphine or something like that. But he recognized me and he called me by my name immediately. A little background about my previous relationship with him. When I was only 18, he and I had a sort of unproductive conversation about the organization that I was a member of, which practices spiritual healing. And I had always known that he, like many people, maintained some misunderstandings about what spiritual healing really is and how it functions. So at this point in the visit, I reminded him of that sort of negative experience that we shared at that time. And I told him that I'd learned a lot since then, and that I was sure that I knew now how we could possibly improve his situation by gaining a better sense of the presence of divine love, which I refer to as God's love for his sake. Because he'd never been particularly religious, but he said he believed in God. But he'd never really investigated the meaning of spirituality either. So I asked him, in view of where he was at, did he want this kind of help? And he obviously could understand me. He could communicate with me in simple phrases. He responded quite definitely and clearly by saying, yes, I want to feel God's love. And that really stood out to me because most of the rest of the conversation had just been yes or no or nodding or shaking the head or looks of confusion. But he seemed very with it and positive when he provided this answer in very clear words. So at that point, I listened for intuition about what to do next. And intuition told me that the best way I could help this man would be to give him the opportunity to hear something from a different perspective about what his relationship to God might be, and of what God actually might really be. And I continued talking to him, assuming that he could understand me fully, even though he was obviously, to the human perception, under the influence of narcotics. But he gradually started to respond better verbally. So there was a Bible in the hospital drawer, and I pulled it out. And I read to him, firmly and slowly, leaving lots of time to reflect and discuss the meaning. We read the 23rd Psalm, the 27th Psalm, and the 91st Psalm. And we talked about God's goodness and completeness, and the logical necessity that his true nature must be the same. But when I said that, he told me that he'd been told from early on that he was born a sinner, and that he believed that his whole life, and he thought God must be disappointed in him. Well, in response to that, then we talked about an idea that was new to him: reflection. We talked about how the true man, the spiritual man we really are, the non-physical man, is the image and likeness, the reflection of all that God is. I talked to him about how the trees around a lake form a reflection on the surface of the lake, and that when the wind blows, the leaves in the reflection are compelled to blow exactly as those in the trees. And we thought about that, and I told him to picture himself as a similar reflection of God. He liked this, and there was a pleasurable look on his face. And I really felt uplifted, because this receptivity was coming from a man who, from my experience, had previously appeared to be really distant and really difficult to know. So I came back the following evening, and again, I was there with him all alone. And at home, in the meantime, when I wasn't at work, well, sometimes part of the time when I was at work, I'd been earnestly praying by working to convince myself to know that receptivity cannot be blocked. Just like the reflection of the trees in a lake cannot be blocked. Reflection just happens, and nothing interferes with the reflection. On his way up to his room, when I got to the hospital that time, I met some family members that were coming down. They were all leaving, and one of them said he wasn't able to recognize who some of us were, so he might not know you, but go ahead and visit him anyway, because he needs the company. So when I entered his room, all alone, just me and him, he didn't look at me, but I went and stood beside him, and his head was pointed the other way. But he realized someone was standing there, and he said, without even turning my way, "Hi, Sterling." He was fully conscious and aware. He doesn't seem to be under the influence of any drugs at that time. And he spoke freely to me at that time about his desire to build his own hope for himself. And he told me that our first meeting had meant a lot to him, and that before I spoke to him about God in this new way, he said he felt like nobody wanted to give him any hope. All the news they gave him was negative. And I responded that I knew they wanted to give him hope, but they simply didn't know how to encourage him, because their own view of the situation was also totally without hope. But he said that since my visit, that there was now definitely a twinkling of real hope in his heart. So I listened for intuition again, and we went ahead and we reviewed again all the same concepts from the last visit, keeping it very simple and dwelling especially on the idea of reflection, which had really connected with him. I assured him that knowing that God is all good and all that exists, then on the basis of that reflection, he must of necessity also be perfect and good. When I asked if these were new ways of looking at himself, he said quite definitely and clearly, yes. He told me he'd always had a hard time thinking of himself as good, let alone as perfect. That seemed impossible. So then we talked about the difference between his true spiritual selfhood as the image of his perfect source and a false and mortal and human, fallible picture of himself. And as he grasped that there was a difference and that wasn't actually his identity, it seemed to satisfy him and bring him some comfort. But while he was in the hospital, I returned a third time the following afternoon. We stayed with simple topics again. We read and reviewed and talked about a little more spiritual depth from the things we'd read from Psalms. And then the other thing that I added to it was we read the account in the Gospel of John about Jesus' healing of the man who'd been born blind. And it turned out that was very significant to him as well. And you'll hear why in a minute. So the following day, he was sent home from the hospital. And not because he was better. The medical diagnosis was that his case was definitely terminal. And it was decided it would be best for him to be attended by a nurse at home to just relieve him from pain. Because the doctors that were in charge of his case had concluded without a doubt that further medical treatment was only going to make him weaker and worsen his condition. So they sent him home to die in a comfortable place. Well, after he'd settled in at home, I visited him again. It had been 2 days since the previous visit. I came by his house on my lunch break from work. And it turned into a really long lunch break. That was okay. I was in business for myself at the time. And we dwelled a bit more on the subject of reflection and pondered some more. And it wasn't a complicated talk. It was a quiet, calm, peaceful talk about the true spiritual meaning of what man is deep down in the highest sense, above the human idea of the physical and material presentation, above the idea of the mortal man, the human being who's born and dies. And so after we pondered that subject, we again went back and read and discussed that same story from the Gospel of John, the account of the healing of the man who'd been born blind. And this is where Jesus said, "Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." And we talked about that, and suddenly I think he recognized that this applied to him. That there was no man for God to be disappointed in. He said he realized he'd done nothing to deserve cancer. He was innocent, not worthy of suffering. So like the blind man who received his sight, my friend perceived, as he described it to me, that he also ought to regain his health and strength. It came out of his mouth in simple words, and I don't know if I have those simple words anymore. But this was very powerful and important to him, and I could see deep pondering going on in his facial expressions. And so we sat there quietly for a while, and I asked him what he thought about this, and he said, "Those are really deep thoughts, and I just have to think about them some more." And then before we left, we also read and pondered a couple of poems. The first one's about hope and trust, and the second one is about strength. And both of them come from a Christian hymnal. Here's the one about hope and trust. Well, just imagine a sick man lying and listening to these words. Trust the eternal when the shadows gather, when joys of daylight seem so like a dream. God, the unchanging, pities like a father. Trust on and wait, the day star yet shall gleam. Trust the eternal, for the clouds that vanish no more can move the mountains from their base than the elusive wreaths of mist can banish light from his throne or loving from his face. Trust the eternal and repent in meekness of that heart's pride which frowns and will not yield. Then to that child heart shall come strength in weakness, and thine immortal life shall be revealed. And then we read this poem about strength. Fight the good fight with all thy might. Christ is thy strength, and Christ thy right. Lay hold on life, and it shall be thy joy and crown eternally. Run the straight race through God's good grace. Lift up thine eyes and seek his face. Life with its way before us lies. Christ is the path and Christ the prize. Faint not nor fear, his arms are near. He changeth not, and thou art here. On him rely, and thou shalt see that Christ is all in all to thee. And we read those quietly and slowly, and we contemplated them. And when I left, I told him to keep at it, and I gave him an encouraging squeeze of the hand. And it was following this meeting that the most wonderful signs began to manifest themselves. I went back to work after my long lunch at about 4 p.m. That evening at home after work, I received news by phone from another family member that had just left my friend's house. And this family member told me that the wife of my sick friend had wondered what we had been talking about. And she said that she thought that I'd prayed with him. After I left, she went in to check on him. Now, for the previous 3 weeks, which had included his latest hospital time, he hadn't eaten anything at all. All of his feeding had been intravenous because his digestive system had ceased to function. During that time, he also hadn't had enough strength to sit up or even turn himself without some assistance. But when his wife went in to check on him, he was sitting up in his bed, and he was fully alert, and he said that he was hungry. And she was surprised, to say the least. And he asked for, and he received, with some objections from her, a bowl of chicken noodle soup, some Vienna sausages, quite a number of soda crackers, and a half a glass of milk. And the food digested normally, and it caused no pain. Whereas previously, that was an impossibility. He hadn't been able to eat anything for weeks. Well, later on, one of his sons came to visit him that night, and he reported back to me the next day that this was the happiest he'd seen his dad in many months, and that he found the change in attitude to be quite unbelievable. And as related to me through my sick friend's daughter, he'd talked with his wife about the things that he and I had prayed about and discussed. She asked if I was talking about God in the context of spiritual healing as defined in the organization she knew that I belonged to which she had some objections. And he asked his wife if that was disagreeable to her. Now, this is secondhand information. I wasn't there. But I'm told that his wife responded by saying something like, "Anything that makes you feel better and gives you hope can only help you." And I'm told that he responded with a comment, something like, "Well, maybe medical doctors don't really have the answers. Maybe there are other ways to look at this thing." Well, it was obvious that the medical doctors didn't have the answers because they had given up on him and sent him home to die. But after I got this secondhand news, I stayed up late that night, and I was just rejoicing in the feeling of the presence of love. I was thinking about how earlier that day he told me how these new thoughts of God and his new view of his potential relationship with God had given him an uplifted sense of hope, which was gradually replacing a sense of what had been deep despair. He said that he actually felt that nobody really cared until I started to show him how to pray by thinking of himself as the reflection of perfection itself. And I told him once again, they did care, but they just didn't understand how to approach his relationship to God with him in a beneficial way, because they too felt that he was defeated. and they too were convinced that he was dying. Again, secondhand, I wasn't there, but I was told by family members that the following morning he asked for and ate a bowl of cereal. Again, with no physical disagreements, and he seemed to be gaining a little bit of strength. But the next day was the last one in which I was able to speak with him in any length about spiritual subjects. And in that last meeting, again, I came to his house and we stayed simple. Again, we talked about the concepts of love from the Psalms. This time we discussed the possible meaning of sacrifice of matter, the voluntary loss of matter that can come about, how a sense of matter can become replaced by a sense of spiritual being as one gains increasing spiritual perspective. And a sense of spiritual being results in a human sense in, you might say, a sense of improved matter. We also discussed how anything antagonistic, anything injurious to anyone is not legitimate. It's not an effect of God. It's not reflection. God's the only valid source, and all that is the reflection of that valid source, and that therefore antagonistic, injurious things are enemies and therefore invalid. We read a couple of accounts of spiritual healing from a reference book on Christianly scientific spiritual healing. And we dwelled on the power of Christ as a principle rather than as a person, and on the usefulness of depending on the content of Jesus' teachings to discover our own true Christ-like being. We talked about how it could be that it was only a false view which could be corrected, but of which the human mind is completely convinced that this false view could be the actual source of the objectionable things which appeared to us humanly as the symptoms of a sick body. And we further contemplated how, since God is good and infinitely good, there could be no possibility for such things to exist in spiritual reality. And we discussed our real and valid identity as being at one with one divine mind, with one divine source. We talked about how maybe there are not actually many independent minds and existences, as our human experience tells us, but that we actually are individualized reflections of that one complete, whole, infinite source mind. I didn't mention it at the time, but I'm going to throw it into this testimony because it's so fitting. Because since then I've come across this parallel example. Example is not the right word. Anyway, this parallel with the components of a hologram. In a hologram, each component is individual. No matter how small you cut up the components of a hologram, each individual component contains 100% of all the same information that's present in the completely assembled picture. So God's very much like a hologram. God's the picture, and the infinite number of individualized components that make up that picture could be represented as the spiritual man. We talked along those lines, but I didn't have the hologram example to talk about at the time. But I bring it up now because I wish I could have been able to provide that explanation to him. But I use the example here to help you grasp what it was we discussed. And he did well the remainder of that day. However, later that day, he was visited by his very well-meaning brother. And his wife told his brother of his great improvement since he'd been thinking about these prospects of being healed spiritually. And I wasn't there, but it was reported to me secondhand that his brother was greatly disturbed by this news, and he warned that he knew a story about someone who died while relying on prayer and spiritual treatment, and who refused medical help. And I thought to myself that actually an argument like this made absolutely no sense in this situation in light of the fact that the doctors had sent him home to die. The doctors had clearly declared that he was going to die, and had themselves already made the decision to cease with the application of further medical treatments. Well, this objection was an imposition of world belief. The world's conviction that only medical science knows. Only medical science is allowed to know how to and to cure all disease. And that medical science has for some reason been granted the exclusive right to heal. I feel like over the last 20, 25 years since this has occurred that perhaps that feeling has weakened a little bit. But anyway, as far as I could interpret it, the feeling being expressed at that time was that of medical science having declared that this man was going to die, and so then it had to happen. Well, I'd done all that I knew how to do. So I prayed and worked mentally to the best of my ability to impersonalize this mistake. Not to blame the person of his brother. Not to make any accusations that would separate one consciousness from another. And to know that nothing can actually stop or block the healing action of love. And perhaps I doubted my own ability to also overcome this objection to the healing that we all had already been witnessing. So that evening I was instructed by telephone by his wife to stop discussing any topics of spirituality with her husband. So I did. The disturbance felt very disrupting, but I complied with the request. I felt and knew at the same time that what he'd gained so far spiritually in terms of changing his self-perception, that could never be lost. That's in consciousness. This is on a Friday, so I let things cool off and I stayed away until the next Wednesday. In the meantime, whenever I could, I spent time focusing on mentally handling subtle forms of aggressively self-righteous human convictions. Well, the Tuesday night before I came to visit him again on that next Wednesday, I got a call from his wife that he was almost passing on during the night. She called about 2:30 in the morning. I kept my perceptions clear, and I stayed up praying and contemplating, knowing what I needed to know from my perspective about him until about 4 a.m. And what I was doing is praying to dissolve the stubborn belief that claimed to be able to separate my friend from learning more of the truth of what actually comprises his spiritual being. So I just worked to see him from my own frame of reference spiritually clearly, and I dwelt on every good aspect of his nature that I'd ever seen and reviewed it over and over again. And during this time of prayer, during that hour and a half or two, I felt a connection, like an interpersonal connection, which could only be described as a feeling of speaking directly with him and feeling that he heard my thought, even though he wasn't present. And I don't know the details of what happened at his house, because I wasn't present, and I wasn't asked to do anything. I only received the call about his serious condition, and that's all I knew. So basically I was praying for myself. Well, he didn't pass on then, and he made it through the night. I don't know, but I think that now he had something to hang on to, at least for that night. He had something to hold on to and fight for life with, and that was hope. So when I spoke with his wife on the phone the next day, I did so with the mental long-distance support of my spiritual teacher backing me up. And I expressed my concern to his wife that there seemed to be some very big misunderstandings going on. Spiritual treatment had been referred to the wife by my friend's brother as brainwashing, negative hypnotism. His son, however, as I pointed out to her, had called me personally immediately after the interference occurred to thank me for giving his father something to live for and to be happy about. So I related her son's viewpoint with her, and I invited her to speak with him for herself and verify what I said and what he said. She said that wasn't necessary because she and her son had already had a conversation about that. She was simply still apprehensive and afraid of an unknown subject. So the best as I could, I explained a little more to her about spiritual healing being the very same practice that Jesus himself brought to the world, and that what her husband and I had essentially discussed was entirely biblical in nature. It consisted of reading some Psalms, some uplifting poetry, and reading from the Gospels and talking about what it might mean. In response, she stated if her husband asked for any more spiritual guidance, it had to be through her, and she might grant that request, but she felt that he needed her specific consent now and protection against what she feared might be a bad influence. Well, I still had a bit of a tough time with that statement, in light of the fact that she literally expected him to die at any moment anyway. The answer to that, of course, is there's no logic to that. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. I did finally have the opportunity to apologize to her husband, my friend, for not having been able to be there for several days when I'd seen him since I'd seen him the last time. And he told me he was aware of the controversy, but since he was a humble man, he thought it was most comfortable for the family if he didn't specifically request prayer from me through his wife. He had something he was holding on to himself, and he only wanted to keep feeling peaceful, and he didn't want to be a part of anyone's controversy. Which makes good sense for a man in a situation like that. The last time I saw him, he was sleeping. In that last visit, I sat by his bedside and I just quietly prayed to be able to continue to see him as God's product, the reflection and perfect image of his source, as a spiritual, non-physical, eternal representation of life. I sat by his bedside and prayed alone with that for maybe 15 minutes. And like I said, when I last saw him, he was in a deep and natural, peaceful sleep. And that was on that Wednesday. He passed away quietly on Friday in the presence of his immediate family, and I'm told he wasn't in any pain. So as I said up front at the beginning, this didn't turn out exactly like I had perceived it could have or should have. But on account of the positive things I witnessed, this was really a touching experience to me. And I know I witnessed dominion over the claim of cancer. There was a battle going on, and seems that once again world belief won that battle. But I knew that the new perceptions of his spiritual identity that he'd gained through his own contemplation would stay with him and would go with him into whatever realm he passed into, because that's in consciousness. And I know that he went on to be a better man in that next phase, whatever and wherever that is for him. A better man than he might have been without this newfound spiritual insight. I think in those few days my friend advanced very far spiritually relative to the way all of his earlier life had unfolded. I remain convinced that this brought to him a new and higher state of being that can never be reversed. And today, 20, going on 25 years later, I still sometimes have dreams about this man. I don't know what they mean or why I have them. I can only speculate. So thank you for listening, and I hope that was inspirational, and I hope that you look forward to future recollections like this one, which I'm also going to be redoing in video format. Until next time, Keep an eye out for my videos. Thank you.